In your book, you talk about some of the benefits, the positives of mental health awareness campaigns. For example, one of the benefits might be that it destigmatizes talking about mental health, talking about mental illnesses. But there are also kind of some downsides to those mental health awareness campaigns. Would you like to maybe kind of discuss some of them, what you see some of the downsides being?
Yes, I think there is. I'm trying to think if that's the same question as saying that the sort of problems with them, but the way I see them being insufficient, I suppose, is that, well, the message is that you should seek help for psychological distress, which in some respects is a really good message and it's useful, but it's problematic when the help isn't there. So quite often, these messages and these campaigns are not being matched with adequate resources in the healthcare system. So it's actually just encouraging people to seek help that isn't available, and that creates its own problem. I think another downside of them is that it can locate the problem within the individual. If a child is being bullied and then has what looks like social anxiety disorder, these campaigns, often it's just about how you deal with the symptoms and how you label them and how you should get help for them without sort of recognizing actually there's a really obvious cause for them. Another issue with them, I think, is that they encourage people to seek help, often informally, like, just tell your friend about it or talk to someone about it. But I think people generally aren't very good at listening. They're not very good at knowing how to respond to a sort of admission of mental distress. So actually some people will pluck up the courage to tell someone about how they're feeling, and then the response they get is not useful or kind of makes the problem worse. So it's this really difficult balance of like you say, like in some respects, it's really a good thing if it encourages people to seek help and get help. But I think it's they're flawed, and I think there's been a bit of a backlash against them now. You start seeing when it's like Mental Health Awareness Week or whatever, people, on Twitter, you see a lot of responses like, we don't need more awareness, we need funding so I can actually get help, for example. And
in your book, you kind of also talk about the problems with language, so terms to do with mental illness. So we might talk about, it's more common to hear about people suffering with anxiety and depression, and there's a downside now that we start to use those terms in everyday language for when we're feeling down or upset about something or feeling a bit worried. We're using these kind of clinical terms. Is that problematic as well?
Yes, I'm really interested in that idea, in that idea as well, because I think it is happening, and I think it's problematic for several reasons. I think if you encourage people to view their distress through the kind of framework of psychiatric disorder, then that might be validating and useful, but it can also sort of exacerbate and extend distress. It can become, there's still an awful lot of problems with stigma. It can become sort of self-fulfilling, like if you conceptualize something as an anxiety disorder and then it makes you less inclined to do the things that you're anxious about, then that can actually make the problem worse. So there's that end of things. And then I'm also interested in the idea that if everyone uses this language, it's sort of those terms lose meaning for the people who really are up at the extreme end of the spectrum and who really do need those terms lose their value and their weight and their meaning if everyone is using them. And then you get this odd sort of skepticism where, supposedly we're supposed to be more enlightened about mental health stuff than ever now, and yet you see a lot of skepticism because it's like, oh, you can't all be unwell, so I'm going to dismiss, everyone who says that they're unwell.
Yeah, and unhelpful commentary in, say, the media where people are branded, or whole groups of people are branded as snowflakes because there might be increasing rates of mental illness in certain populations. And
and it really frustrates me because even if people are using this language unnecessarily or inappropriately for their own problems, it's not their fault. Like, this is the language that they've been given. Like, we've actively, especially young people, adults who've designed these campaigns have actively encouraged the idea that you should, that you might have a mental health problem, that you should label it as such and talk about it as such. So it's really not there. It's not surprising that this framework has been adopted by young people.